Welcome to the latest in the short videos from the Liverpool Law School, providing our analysis of developments in the unfolding process of the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. Today we're going to offer some thoughts on the Prime Minister's speech of the 17th of January 2017, setting out her objectives for the withdrawal process. The speech was greeted by a veritable orgy of adulation in the press, but I think it's probably a good idea to offer a more sober and a more balanced analysis. Because the reality is that once we strip aside the very considerable passages of rhetoric from the speech, on most of the key issues, we actually learned very little that we didn't already know. Almost all of the big issues were already obvious from government statements over the past several months, obvious anyway to those of us who were prepared to listen. There was relatively little by way of further elaboration, and on the contrary, I think the speech reveals certain difficult tensions and contradictions at work in the government's policy thinking on this issue. So let's begin with what I think are the four key points of the government's negotiating position in relation to our relations with the European Union. First, we're no longer going to be a member of the single market, not even as a member of the European Economic Area. Now that's been obvious for really quite some time. If we're not going to accept the free movement of persons, and if we're not going to accept the loss of political influence and leadership that comes with leaving the EU but seeking to remain a member of the single market, then we're leaving the single market. And instead, the government wants to seek an ambitious free trade agreement with the EU, covering some combination of free movement for goods, services, capital, and various types of persons. Again, I think that was pretty obvious. But what sort of free trade agreement does the government have in mind? After all, there's no standard text that we can pull off a shelf. There's a vast array of questions that have to be asked. There's an enormous amount of negotiation to be done. What will be the scope and the depth of this agreement? What issues will it cover, and how ambitious will it seek to be? How far will the UK simply be expected to comply with the existing rules and future rules of the EU in order to preserve market access? Will it cover policies such as competition, public procurement, state aid? Will it require minimum standards of protection also for the environment, consumers, workers? And what losses will we have to accept in return for rejecting the free movement of persons? But just as importantly, what sorts of political and decision-making institutions does the government have in mind in order to allow the UK and the EU to develop our legislative and administrative cooperation? And especially important, what type of dispute settlement mechanisms will we agree upon, especially given the government's apparent aversion, frankly, relatively paranoid, to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice? It's very easy to say that we want a trade agreement. Lots of people in the world do. But on virtually every key issue that will need to be addressed within that agreement, this speech tells us very little indeed. Secondly, we're no longer going to be members of the customs union. Now again, this has been pretty obvious for really quite some time. Membership of the customs union would in itself have carried quite extensive regulatory obligations, as well as significant limitations on a country's freedom of action in its trade relations with the outside world. So instead, the government wants to seek a special relationship with the customs union, no doubt providing for the total or near total elimination of customs duties between the UK and the EU. We still don't really know what scope that agreement will cover. Will it be all manufactured goods? Will it be agricultural goods? Will it be fisheries products? But just as importantly, of course, even with an extensive customs agreement, we'll still have to apply the usual rules of origin to each other's goods to make sure that third country goods don't benefit from the special fiscal privileges that are meant to be reserved from each other's products. So all of the usual paraphernalia of customs borders, customs checks, pre and post formalities will still apply, which is precisely the issue which is causing particular concern over the land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Thirdly, other than the issues surrounding trade, the Prime Minister has indicated that the UK wants to continue strong cooperation with the EU in fields such as research, crime, terrorism, security. That's welcome news, of course, but again, it feels rather obvious and the detail is almost entirely lacking. What scope, what depth, and again, what structures, both political and judicial, does the government have in mind here in order to underpin any meaningful degree of cooperation, especially in such sensitive policy fields as crime, justice and security? Fourthly, but very far from the least, and the government has indicated in this speech that the UK wants all of these issues to be agreed upon within a period of 2 years after our notification under Article 50, followed by some sort of phased implementation after we've actually withdrawn to allow different sectors to adapt to their new frameworks and regimes. Now, this part of the speech, I think, was particularly vague and unconvincing. To begin with, we should recall that the widespread assumption that any framework for future relations is separate from the actual withdrawal agreement from the divorce settlement under Article 50, and it should only be finalised after the UK has already left and become a third country. That assumption is based on a robust legal interpretation of Article 50, viewed within the context of its position within the EU legal system. The treaties clearly envisage that these two agreements are legally, institutionally and procedurally separate. Is the government trying to overturn that assumption, to have a single agreement, effectively trying to rewrite the treaties in our own interests? It's simply not clear. Now, even if we manage to persuade the other member states and EU institutions to share that assumption, in principle, the timescale for this sort of agreement in practice simply doesn't feel credible. Given the sheer range, the novelty, the complexity, the sensitivity of the issues involved, it simply doesn't feel credible that it will be achieved within that timescale. And in any event, the Prime Minister's timescale really hinges upon this idea of securing a full and final agreement on our future relationship, but also designing some sort of scheme for its phased implementation. And on this key element of the negotiating package, the Prime Minister's speech is virtually a blank page. It's very difficult to imagine what the government really has in mind here. It feels more like an aspiration than a thought-out plan, perhaps primarily designed to calm market nerves. So those are the four, I think, key strands in the UK's objectives for its negotiations with the EU. Of course, as the Prime Minister acknowledged, this is a negotiating position. It means nothing in itself because agreement needs the consent of both parties. There will be lots to argue about, not least the question of whether we're being realistic in our demands, whether we're overestimating or at least overstating the strength of our negotiating position. Now, those are questions to be debated over time. Here and now, let's just highlight, I think, two key issues that arise from the Prime Minister's speech. First of all, and contrary to what I think is being claimed in the government and a lot of the media, this is not, even in itself, an especially coherent set of principles and objectives. Far from it, I think this speech reveals certain tensions and even contradictions in the government's thinking for the future. We'll just take one example for now. The Prime Minister wants the UK to be one of the leading champions of free trade in the world, striking ambitious deals not just with the EU but with a whole host of other countries as well. At the same time, however, the UK wants full national sovereignty. We want to reject external control or influence over our own laws and our own courts. But those two things are simply incompatible with each other. Trade deals necessarily involve accepting restrictions, often very extensive restrictions on your sovereignty. They always entail a degree of external control and influence. They will have profound effects upon your domestic law, and they inevitably involve subjugation to some form of external judicial or arbitral authority. Being a champion of free trade and having full national sovereignty is simply a fantasy. Second point, the Prime Minister's threatening ultimatum to the rest of the EU of what will happen if we don't get the deal that we want, it may well have driven the Daily Express, the Daily Mail into a state of ecstasy, but in fact I think this was the weakest and the most worrying part of the whole package. If you're going to make serious trade threats, then they need to be credible and you need to be prepared to see them through. Is it really very realistic to argue, with no deal in place, that the EU economy is going to suffer all manner of terrible retributions and calamities while the UK economy, according to the speech, will apparently sail on virtually unaffected? But more importantly, is the Prime Minister really serious that if we don't get the deal that we want with the EU, we will respond by radically altering the entire basis of our own economic and social model by slashing corporate taxes, dismantling regulatory standards, so as to become a country whose future is defined by low taxes, lower public services, lower social standards, lower productivity. Even if it were nothing else, as a means of retaliating against the EU, that seems a rather disproportionate reaction. and one whose adverse consequences would appear to fall largely upon us rather than upon them. And another example, I think, of the inherent tension and contradiction that runs throughout the government's position, it's rather difficult to square this threat with the Prime Minister's promise to build a fairer Britain, which works for all people, not just the rich, but also the vulnerable. Now, it may well be that the Prime Minister was being more cynical than that, laying the groundwork to blame the EU if and when negotiations don't go our way. It's not that we've made unreasonable demands to be delivered within unfeasible timescales. It was the awful EU that wanted to punish Britain for breaking free from its vice-like grip. It's usually a good idea to have someone else ready to blame for your own failures. But for now, let's take the Prime Minister at face value. And in that case, I think what makes their threats particularly worrying is that they illustrate all manner of wider dangers. And in particular, the danger that outside of the European Union, with its commitment to standards of social welfare, its aversion to unfair competition based on a race to the bottom in regulatory standards, it will be entirely open to a future government to engage in this sort of deconstruction of our existing environmental, consumer, employment and welfare rules, and ultimately to shift us towards a deregulated neoliberal economic model with all of the consequences that go with it. If that really is to become the centrepiece of the UK's future trade policy, then I suspect that even many Leave voters will end up getting a lot more, or rather a lot less, than they bargained for. So, where does that leave us? The Prime Minister's speech has told us a lot of things that we knew already, and a few things that we didn't. But one gets a strong sense, I think, that the government is still painting with a pretty broad brush, and hasn't quite reached a credible understanding of what's really possible and what's really realistic, and perhaps fails to recognise or at least admit some of the underlying tensions and contradictions at work in its own position. But of course this all remains merely the starting point for a long and complex negotiation to come, and if things don't work out as the Prime Minister would like, then we need to be vigilant that the blame is apportioned where the blame really belongs, not where either political convenience or blockheaded jingoism would like it to lie.